Hello there. Today I thought I'd try something special, so I have here a bottle of Tenuta San Guido's Sassicaia 2020. So Sassicaia, a wine with its own DOC, Bolgheri Sassicaia. As far as the Wine Searcher website is concerned, Sassicaia is consistently the most searched for Italian wine on our site and is regarded by most people as having been the original Super Tuscan wine. Sassicaia, meaning field of stones, results from the fact that in 1943 the Marchese, Incisa, della Rocchetta, identified some sites and started planting Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc on some hillside sites slightly to the south of the tiny town of Bolgheri, in the south of Tuscany. The Marchese had inherited, I believe through his wife's family, an estate of about 2,500 hectares that ran from an area of beach at the sea up to the hills around Bolgheri. The estate's activities were predominantly farming, there was forestry, there's a racing stable there, but the Marchese was a lover of Cabernet Sauvignon, the wines of Bordeaux, and felt that he'd found some sites that would actually suit the growing of this variety. His first attempts to produce wine were somewhat dismissed by the locals, who were used to drinking red wine the year after it had been made, and therefore found that the structure, the grassy notes, and the crisp acidity of Cabernet Sauvignon were unpalatable to them. However, when some of these wines were tried again in the early 1960s, their quality was a real revelation, and the reaction to these wines was sufficient to persuade the Marchese to replant some of his original vineyards and to plant further vineyards as well. The plantings were predominantly Cabernet Sauvignon, with some Cabernet Franc vines as well. In 1972, he entered an agreement with the Antinoris family that they would market his wines, and this was to start with the 1968 vintage. At the same time, an enologist, Giacomo Takis, who was Antinoris' chief enologist, was engaged to become the consultant winemaker here. At this stage, the wine was simply a vino da Tavola, a lowly table wine, but it very soon made an impression. The wine rapidly improved in quality and was soon recognised as one of Italy's leading wine. Incisa della Rocchetta passed in 1983, and his family oversee the estate here. So this is Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc being grown in a relatively warm region. So the vineyards that Sassicaia come from tend to be those that were the original plantings of the estate that were high in the hills, and they're at altitudes varying between 100 and 400 metres above sea level, where you have the cooling effect of the altitude, and also the nearby sea gives regular onshore and offshore breezes that also reduce the temperature and enable the grapes to retain their freshness. The name Sassicaia, translating roughly as field of stones, it's not surprising that the soils here are full of pebbles, there's lots of marl. There are areas of clay, but there's really a predominance of limestone as well here. The vintage started with a winter which was mild and there was abundant rain. Cold north winds at the end of March did give some frost, and that affected the Cabernet Franc. The Cabernet Sauvignon, however, being late ripening, wasn't damaged by the frost at all. A wet spring with average temperatures gave excessive vegetation, and it was necessary to reduce both the crop and the canopy to keep the vines in balance. From about mid-June onwards through till harvest, it was warm and sunny. Now there were some minor rain events both in July and August, but those actually served to keep the vine healthy. And ripening occurred 7 to 8 days earlier than normal. Harvest started in September. The first week of September saw them pick the Cabernet Franc, after which picking started with Cabernet Sauvignon in the lower altitude vineyards. The vineyards that the grapes for Sassicaia came off predominantly at high altitude, and most of those were harvested in the last week of September. Everything was picked by hand, and when it arrived at the winery, it went onto sorting tables to get rid of any damaged or underripe or undersized fruit. In general, however, the weather conditions had meant that the grapes had generous sugar levels. The fruit was healthy, i.e. it wasn't rotten, and the tannins were generally quite ripe. Once the fruit had been sorted, it was destemmed, it was crushed and went into stainless steel tanks for fermentation. Fermentation took place with indigenous yeasts, so those were yeasts that had come into the winery on the fruit or were already in place in the winery conducting fermentation. No yeasts were added, there was no inoculation. Fermentation temperatures were kept down to 27 to 28 degrees C to stop them getting too high and being too extractive. Instead, the extraction was managed by regular pump overs and also rack and return. So pump over, where you're just pumping juice over the top of the cap back into the tank. Rack and return, where you take all the must out of the tank, allow the cap of skins to fall to the bottom and replace the fermenting must above it. Fermentation was complete by the end of October and a gentle pressing took place. Malolactic conversion took place in tank, and that happened in November. Then in December, after a number of rackings to ensure that the wine was clear, it went into barrel. The wine spent an entire 25 months in barrel, which is a relatively long time even for a wine of this quality. Those barrels were all French oak barriques, so relatively small, and 45% of those were new. Of the remaining 55%, 45% of those had been used just once before, and the remaining 10% had been used twice before. There's a relatively generous oak component to this wine, and a long period to fix and fine those tannins in there through that gentle oxidation through the staves of the barrel. At the end of barrel aging, the wine is blended. It then ages further in bottle prior to release to allow it to marry and become harmonious. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? Looking at it, it has a relatively dark ruby colour. It's of probably medium to deep intensity. I can see through it relatively easily. The wine's label says it has 14% alcohol. Very readily forming tears on the side of the glass there as I swirl it. So let's have a look at the aromas, shall we? The aromas are rich and they're high toned, they're very lifted, they're perfumed. There's almost a sort of a controlled volatility going on here. There are balsamic notes there, but before you get to those, you've got wonderful notes of lively mulberry, loganberry, raspberry, those sort of red fruit notes. There are underlying notes of sort of dried leaves, forest floor. There are mushroom hints. There really is quite a savoury note, as well as this sort of lively red fruit. The two are a lovely contrast. Almost a sort of a slightly spicy touch as well. There's plenty going on here. Perhaps the fruit sort of opens up to a more sort of dark red, jammy fruit by the end. So let's have a taste. Concentrated and relatively close. You do see that sort of deep red fruit note. There's raspberries, there's loganberries, there's ripe red plum. And I'm saying plum because I'm thinking of that sort of slight leafy touch you can get with a plum, and yet there's a texture and a richness as well. A very ripe plum skins, almost moving through to darker black plum, a dams and a bullis sort of note. There's a real concentration on the mid palate. This doesn't seem to be a heavy wine, but it's structured. It has fine supple tannins and plenty of them. There's almost a sort of a slightly chocolatey texture. I'm not particularly getting a sort of a chocolatey milky note on the mid palate. There's actually, fine structure that's perhaps hinting slightly at a little bit of cedar, but that's very much in with the fruit. It doesn't sort of particularly stand out. It's really quite concentrated fruit that's to the fore on this, and it's lasting very well right across the palate. It's really quite plush. You sort of feel a little of those slightly savoury notes, almost a sort of a mushroom touch, but I don't mean that in any way in a derogatory way. It's a sort of an umami note right across the mid palate there. This is very young to be broaching a bottle of Sassicaia, but I think the wine is showing it. I haven't really mentioned the acidity, because the acidity is being kept very well in balance by this powerfully structured fruit. And yet at the same time it's there, because it's giving that lovely lively red fruit note round the edges of the palate there. The intensity of the wine is giving lovely long flavour. It's not so intense that it becomes sort of licoricey and dense and closes up the middle of the palate. Instead, this is open and the flavours are long, perhaps becoming slightly spicy at the end. That may be a little bit of the alcohol. The alcohol's in balance, it's 14%. The concentrated fruit is stopping it from being hot and overpowering the fruit at the end. Instead, it's sort of slightly peaking up some of the delicate notes of sort of cinnamon and nutmeg that's coming from oak aging on the back there. But the oak is really, it's seamlessly integrated. These are just hints that you're getting. The flavours are long, but at the same time, the whole thing seems very closed up. With time, you feel should open, show a lot more of the fruit on the palate that's being indicated by the perfume on the nose. I took a look at the Wine Searcher aggregated critic score for this vintage of this wine, and we have this as 96 out of 100. If anything, I almost wonder if that's a little unfair for the wine. I certainly think that given time, if those perfumes open, as I believe they will, this is a wine that is probably going to exceed that rating. I think the harmony, the length, the intensity and the balance of this wine suggests to me that in future a greater complexity, some of those savoury elements and more of those beautiful perfumes are going to open out, and it's going to exceed that rating. I hope that's the case. The notes I've seen suggest that you could probably keep this in your cellar until at least the early 2040s, and some people suggest the later 2040s. Certainly this is a wine that needs more time to really express itself. However, it's currently still a beautiful wine and it's showing some fantastic potential. So yes, the other issue is this is not by any means a cheap wine. I will leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, so that you can see where it's available near you and what the price is. And obviously any quality assessments need to be made in the light of that. However, I do think it's undeniable that this is a wine that reaches a level of quality that's exceptional. So thank you so much for joining us. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, do please press the like button. If you'd like to watch more of these tastings, it would be fantastic if you consider signing up and subscribing to our channel. That way you can also set yourself an alert and be warned every time we publish a new tasting. If you have friends you think might like to see the video, please feel free to pass it on. We'd really appreciate that sort of endorsement coming from you. If you have any comments, do please pop them in the box below. We'd really love to hear from you what you think about the wines we're looking at, the tastings we're doing, or anything else that relates to that. So thanks again for watching, and I do hope you'll manage to make some time, come and join us for another tasting in the very near future. Thanks again. Bye for now.